Okay, good morning to everybody. Now we start the plenary session of this amazing conference organized here in Estonia. This day we have two keynote speakers this morning, one coming from GRC, the other coming from University of Scotland, Highlands University, and Highlands University too. And the first one is Jesus San Miguel Alliance, coming from GRC. GRC is an important joint research center based in this case, in northern part of Italy, in Ispra. And Jesus is the boss, the leader of the forest team. It's a pleasure for me to introduce him, as he did a lot for the forest research in terms of especially wildfires, IFIS, the information forest fires system. And now he is working to a new information system dedicated to all the data of the forests existing in Europe. Each keynote speaker has around 30 minutes, not more, if it's possible, also less, for having some question after the presentation. Please, Jesus.
Thank you, Giovanni. Good morning, everyone. I would like first to thank Giovanni, Urmas, and the rest of the organizers for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to address an audience that is not really the common audience I'm usually addressing to, which is forestry. So this is a much broader community. What I'll be presenting is a little bit the activities and the aims, the goals of the European Union, the European Commission, to establish what is called the Forest Information System for Europe. Europe is, I think, the most complicated region of the world, because we have within the European Union 28 countries, all with different languages, different systems, and our goal is to have a common information system gathering all the information that the countries already have in their national level. So, let me... As Giovanni said, I'm coming from the Joint Research Center. For those of you that are not European, the Joint Research Center is a Director General of the European Commission, which could be equivalent to a federal government of the European Union. As I said, we are 28 countries, and for me, the basis of any objective related to sustainability is to have sound information, to be able to assess if we are moving in the right direction or not. Because as I will show, we have many different policies, many different strategies, but as long as we don't have information, we will never be able to assess where we are going. This is a little bit the outline, some facts about forests in Europe, for those of you that are not familiar with that, the overarching initiatives of the EU, then some more concrete policies, and then I will show some of the targets of the European Union regarding these policies, which involve forestry. The objectives of the EU Forest Strategy in 2013, the European Union adopted a new forest strategy for the coming years. The previous one was from 1998, so it lasted many years, and there was an implementation plan. The idea of this strategy, as I will show, is to try to put together the different goals and the different targets and have a coherent progress towards those targets. And then I will show a little bit the different activities we have within the Joint Research Center in the context of the Forest Information System for Europe and the next steps. Some facts about forests in Europe. Forests cover around 40% of the European Union, around 160 million hectares. But they are very fragmented. So many of the forests in Europe are owned by private owners. So that makes it even more difficult to have a common strategy and common activities. Many of them, around 25%, are in protected areas, so they have some restrictions for management. But most of them are open to the general public. There are around 3.5 million working in the forest sector. So it's a very important sector in terms of area covered by forest, but also in terms of economy. We have, in terms of growing stock, around 26.5 billion cubic meters, so a large amount of resources. And we produce yearly around 405 million cubic meters. And we are currently harvesting around 60 to 70% of the existing annual increment of forests. But forests are also a big reserve of carbon, and they are a source of, a mechanism for carbon sinks. And all these are related to different policies. In terms of economy and forest area, we see that the forest sector is very important. If we compare it to agriculture, which is really important and moves a lot of billion every year, we see that the forest sector is not far from it. So we have around 150 billion gross annual value per year as compared to 200 in agriculture. So it's a really huge sector as a whole. Regarding overarching initiatives or strategies of the European Union, there is a Europe 2020 strategy for growth and jobs, very general, that aims at resource efficiency, a more greener Europe, a more competitive economy, more use of renewable resources, and less emissions. Clearly, this affects forests and how they are used in the European Union. Then we have a map for resource efficiency in Europe, industrial policy involving huge programs like Copernicus. Copernicus is the European Union space program. It is very large. It includes all the development of satellite, but also the production of information layers, like the urban layer or the forest layer or the water layer, high-resolution layers, which are updated continuously. The EU climate and energy package, of course, very important for forestry, because forestry is one of the main resources for renewable energy, as I will show in the coming slides. When we get more concrete about policies, we have many. I will just list them. LULUCF is land use changes in forestry. There are projections from member states that show that there will be an increase in the use of resources and less sinks. Life Plus regulation, so it's a regulation of environment financing projects on forest information, but not only. The EU timber regulation that controls that the timber coming in the EU comes from sustainable sources. The rural development policy is the main source for foresters, for financial sources. So the rural development policy tries to promote the forest sector within the rural economy. The framework program for research and innovation, which finances all the forestry-related projects, so financed by the European Union. So those are policies, but then we also have strategies. And we have the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2020, the Bioeconomy Strategy, try to mobilize resources, improve the knowledge base. We have the Plant Health and Reproductive Strategy, controlling the sources of the different plants so that we don't have problems of pests and spread of pests in Europe. And finally, the EU Forest Strategy. The idea of having a EU Forest Strategy was to try to put together the different goals and targets of the different policies. But still, we don't have a EU forest policy. So it is impossible for the European Union or the European Commission to impose anything in the 28 member states. So we have to cooperate with them to try to gather information that will let us know where we are going. When we look at the different targets, and these are just some, so we have a 20% reduction of CO2 by 2020, which will be increased to 40% by 2030. We also try to have reach 20% energy production from renewable sources. Currently, 50% of the renewable energy in Europe, in the European Union, is coming from forests. So if we are going to increase the renewable energies, and part of this will come from forests, forests will have a big stress. So there will be a lot of demands from forestry to provide these resources. But then on the other hand, we have the biodiversity strategy, by which we need to preserve the forest to ensure conservation and biodiversity in the long term. We have the timber regulation, as I mentioned, which I consider very important, because what we are doing in forestry in Europe has a big impact in third countries, in developing countries especially, because part of the forest resources, the timber that is used in the European Union, come from these resources. The LULUCF accounting rules, and as I said, the idea of the EU forest strategy is to put together these different targets that in many cases I think are contradictory. So it is, from my point of view, impossible to achieve all the targets simultaneously. So in order to assess where we are in the different targets, we still need an information system of the different forest resources, which we don't have at the moment. And that is exactly what we are trying to do. The main two objectives of the EU forest strategy, the first one and the most important, is to ensure that multifunctional potential of the EU forest is managed in a sustainable and balanced way, enabling our forest vital ecosystem service to function correctly. So the European Commission has put a lot of emphasis in trying to demonstrate that forests in Europe are really managed sustainably, because there is no proof of that. There is the Forest Europe initiative, the ministerial conference, in which we prepared a report every 4 years, and countries are providing standardized data to this report. But the information is really very limited, so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to assess the sustainable management of forests in Europe. And then there are other objectives, I will not go in detail, but related to the previous targets, aiming at trying to put together the different goals of the strategy. And what is at the base of the strategy is the Forest Information System for Europe. So the JRC was given the responsibility to develop a Forest Information System for Europe, collecting all the information that is available in the different countries. And this is a huge task. So we started around 1.5 years ago. We are still working on it. And what I will present in the next slides are the different activities we are doing within the Forest Information System for Europe, which is not really a system, it's a group of researchers and people working to put together the information of forestry. The strategy is conceived as a tree. So you have like the canopy, which is coordination and communication, then the trunk and the branches, which is the contribution to major societal objectives, and then you have at the bottom the knowledge base. The knowledge base for me is the fundamental part of it, it's the roots of the whole strategy. If we don't have a knowledge base, we can have as many strategies as we may want, but we will not be able to determine where we are. The different initiatives that are launched by the Directorate Generals of the Commission, and I will show you in this slide the different ones, are the way we have to work with the countries. We can have tenders. Well, we launch projects, and then these are open tenders. Anyone can apply, any consortia of different participants in the countries. And these are launched by all the Commission services. Then we have a collaboration with the National Forest Inventories, a framework contract by which we buy data from the countries. Obviously, because there is no regulation, countries do not have any obligation to provide information to the European Commission. So we need to finance the processing of the existing data to arrive to harmonized data. It is impossible, for instance, if you look at just one parameter, biomass. You cannot just collect the different biomass information from the different countries, put this information together and have a European Union biomass layer, because the methods are different, the units are different, and the information is just not compatible. So what we do with the National Forest Inventories is finance the development of harmonized data sets. And we have been working with them for the last 8 years on this. Then we have collaboration research organizations. We try to be part of as many projects as possible. JRC, even though it's a big research organization, is still limited. So we cannot really follow the research that is done in the different projects. And what is, I think, sad is that when forest research projects are finalized after 4 or 5 years of very good research by the best different research organizations in the European Union, the information is often lost. So they don't have budget to maintain websites, they cannot maintain data sets. So one of the roles of the Forest Information System for Europe would be to act as a repository of the information that is developed in the different projects. And then the in-house activities we have in our forest research group. Here you have a list of, it is not a comprehensive list, of the different directorate generals of the European Commission dealing directly with forestry. So you have agriculture, they are financing most of the forestry measures in Europe, CLIMA, dealing with all the climate change adaptation and mitigation, development and cooperation, all the activities outside Europe in terms of developing countries, deforestation, degradation, energy, of course the Energy Union strategy, enterprise or grow, environment, Eurostat collecting information, the Joint Research Center, RTD financing research, DG Sanco dealing with forest health, and then ECO dealing with forest fires and big disasters, storms, and so on. We are around 33,000 people in the European Commission, and we are divided in these directorate generals. So the only way to coordinate the different activities is through what is called the Inter-Service Group on Forestry. So we meet every 1.5 months, the different DGs, we inform each other of the ongoing work, and then we discuss with our colleagues the future initiatives. I don't want to get too boring, but I think it is important for you to understand that the European Commission is very complex. It's nearly as complex as the different member states, so it is difficult to coordinate activities. So one of the main goals this is text coming from the EU Forest Strategy, is to set up a forest information system for Europe. And it was already written in the strategy in 2013 that the system would have 4 different modules dealing with natural disturbances, with bioeconomy, with climate change, and ecosystem services. And that is exactly what we started doing a couple of years ago. We are 2015. This was adopted in September 2013. So we are exactly now 2 years from the adoption of the strategy. The idea is not new. So some of our colleagues and I had a publication already in 2005 aiming at establishing a forest information system for Europe. But the momentum was not there. Now with the EU Forest Strategy, we hope that we will be able to achieve this goal. And I will show the different activities we are carrying in at the Joint Research Center in the different topics. This is the structure of the Forest Information System for Europe, which we expect to open at the end of this year. And with the different 4 modules on ecosystem services, disturbances, climate change, and bioeconomy. In terms of disturbances, Giovanni mentioned our previous work our work still on forest fires. So we established the first system in Europe providing standardized, harmonized information on forestry was on forest fires, and that was the European Forest Fire Information System. We are now working at the global level. So the same concept is now being extended at the global level with international partners in the context of GEO, which is the Group for Earth Observations. We have activities on forest damages, mainly big damages due to storms. This is the storm in Slovakia in 2004, I believe, and then this was Kirill in Germany in 2007. When there is a major damage, countries can request what is called the EU Solidarity Fund, by which the European Commission provides financial aid to the countries to remediate the damage. And the JRC is the one evaluating the damages on the Commission side. So for that, we develop remote sensing tools that we can use for different activities. We are also working on pest spread. And the basis of this is information we collected also from the National Forest Inventories from over 1 million plots in Europe on the distribution of forest species. This is used to assess the potential spread of pests. So if you have a pest starting, for instance, here, then depending on the host species, you can determine how this pest will be spreading. Of course, depending on the connectivity, and that is, you had a 2-day workshop on connectivity and fragmentation by my colleague Peter Vogt. So we use his tools to assess the potential propagation of the pests. And then we are currently working on the potential propagation of what is called the pine wood nematode that broke out in Portugal in 1990. Now it is all spread through the country. and it kills all the pines, especially Pinus pinaster. So if it spreads in the rest of Europe, it will kill all the pines up to the center of Europe. It has a buffer of temperature, so it could not go further north. And we are developing remote sensing tools for this purpose. We collaborate, of course, with the different DGs. In this case, it is Sanco that is dealing with plant health. And we also collaborate with any initiative that is working on this topic. For us, it's very important to have a good networking. And we already have a good network and a lot of collaboration, but we need to expand this because the Forest Information System for Europe is not a JRC tool. It should be for Europe. It should include all the activities that are being carried out at the European level. So this is as far as we go on disturbances. On ecosystem services, we are working on what is called MAES, Mapping and Assessment of Ecosystem Services, which is a large program of the European Union, mainly the environment, but also JRC, for mapping what is existing in terms of ecosystem services in the countries. So the first part is mapping, second part is assessment, and the third part would be the economic valuation of these ecosystem services. There was a presentation just before the summer in Brussels, and my colleague Jose Barredo in our group is the one coordinating this project, pilot project at the European level. Again, here, there is no obligation from member states to collaborate with the Commission, so it is on a voluntary basis, which makes it difficult, because obviously member states do not have financial resources to do everything. Then we are working also on forest pattern and connectivity, on green infrastructure assessment. On, as I said, connectivity, this is one of the maps that will come in the Forest Europe Report 2015 on the different connectivity in the different countries, forest connectivity. As I said, it's not possible to put the information from the different countries together to have a European layer. So we are trying to derive European layers from either remote sensing or from other sources. This is growing stock. And this is used by other colleagues at JRC to assess the potential use of energy, of forest residues for energy. And this is in the collaboration with Forest Europe. On climate change, there are also a series of activities. As I said, the first thing we did was the mapping of distribution of forest species. We have around 200 species at 1 kilometer covering all Europe. And this data will be published at the end of this year. They are already being used by projects. We are assessing also the potential shift in fire regimes according to climate change. Some other people in our unit are working on assessing deforestation at the global level and the implications that that has for climate policy worldwide. And within Europe, we are working also on LULUCF, assessing the potential of mitigation in terms of changing carbon stock or in terms of substitution of the use. So there is a lot of carbon that is not accounted for instance, in construction. So all the wood that is used for construction is not accounted for in terms of sinks. In the bioeconomy, and we started this work around 2 years ago, we are developing tools to assess policy impacts. So the European Union has strategies and policies, but we did not have models to assess the potential impact of different policies. So these tools, so the wood resource balance, the global forest trade model, the European forestry dynamics model, and the EVA will allow us to determine if we want to reach the biodiversity target, what is the implication for the target related to energy, or the other way around. The last model, the EVA, is important because, as I mentioned before, we have 16 million forest owners, and the response of the forest owners to the market will be very different. The tendency lately is not to use forests. For instance, in Sweden, forest owners do not really care about the timber price. They will not cut the resources. So, and we have to see how these owners respond to the different incentives. And this is just one example of changing the allowable cut and how this affects all growth. You see, by increasing the forest age to cut, we increase the amount of old growth forests. That is the overall goal of these models. In terms of dissemination, our goal is mainly to provide input for policy making. So we do a lot of reports that go directly of course they're public, but they go to the different DGs to try to provide base information for policy making. And the last publication we are working on, as I said, is a forest atlas of 3 species of Europe, which is the basis of many of our activities. In terms of how we work, we have at the center the Forest Information System for Europe. That, as I said, is not an information system, but a group of people. We receive the input or the feedback from the Interservice Group on Forestry, all the DGs working in the forest sector. Then we also receive the information coming from the Life Plus projects and the Interreg projects, which are many. The outputs of the RTD projects, Horizon 2020. Then we have already networks with all the member states regarding forest fires, regarding forest information. The Standing Forestry Committee, which is the committee representing member states to the Commission, and the different research groups. That's why we try to participate in as many networks, cost actions, and research groups as possible. And that's the way we work and the way we intend to continue to develop FISE. In terms of further development, we will have the prototype open to the public at the end of this year. We will continue developing the metadata catalog, which is essential to access the data, enhancing the interface, including information from existing projects like Plus, RTD, Copernicus, and also Horizon 2020. And then strengthening the links to other initiatives that are working on similar topics. And I think with this, I end my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jesus. You provided a very short time, a lot of information for us, especially for people not coming from the forest field. Joy Research Center is a really good next for everything regarding the environment and forest too. And you provide a lot of information for us also for assessing from the landscape ecology point of view. There is any question, please? 2 questions. The lady.
Sorry, if we have information on RTD initiatives on yes, we are participating in the research projects that are ongoing in forestry. Now, the first call on forestry from Horizon 2020 was on the bioeconomy. So we are trying to join the Diablo project that is just started. There is a second call on forest modeling. We will join the winning consortium. So the idea is that the JRC leads, not leads, relates to ongoing projects. And we are participating currently. I mean, we just finished the integral project on forest management at landscape level. We are participating in Seawood, which is dealing with enhanced mobilization of forestry biomass in Europe. And the rest of the initiatives are really in the different programs. So in Life Plus, there is a specific program to have projects related to EFIS or to the European Forest Data Center. Again, in Horizon 2020, we encourage, and RTD encourages, projects that support the development of FISE. But there is not, as I said, there are many different initiatives. There is not a common point of information. We'll try to gather this information and make it available in FISE.
The second question?
Yeah, related question concerning data and information flow from ongoing or past projects, which, for example, the National Forest Inventory Harmonization, a lot of things have been going on already in cost actions in other EU framework programs, 7 programs. So what's the information flow from these older programs, projects to this FISE?
Yes, very good question. That's one of the problems that I mentioned in my presentation was the flow of information from projects to FISE. before like 10 years ago, we were coordinating Forest Focus. That was the only regulation of the EU on forest information. And we have been collaborating with the National Forest Inventories for like 15 years in the cost actions. First the E43 and use wood, and probably in the next one. The problem with not the problem, the cost actions are research activities, research initiatives, and they do not develop information. They do not develop data sets. They develop information on methods and definitions, but not data. In fact, that's why we need to finance the data. The cost action may define a methodology to estimate biomass in a harmonized way, but they will not develop the data set. So we will need to finance it, and that's what we are doing. So.
The last one, Sandra.
Yes, my question is about bias that you mentioned and the issue that we have there that is being done on a different basis. So how is your perception in terms of where we are now? And we know the many countries that are late for the reporting. You see that we are going finally to reach the targets, or at least which can be the success with the mines according to your experience?
Yes. Yeah, a difficult question. Yes. As I said, MICE is a voluntary process. So the first part has gone very well. So the response from the countries has really been very positive. So we are quite enthusiastic that the next phase will also go that way. The first part is mapping what is existing in the countries and trying to harmonize the information. So we are still in this process. Initially, it was a pilot project with only the participation of a few member states. We are now trying to engage the rest of the member states, and then we will follow up from there. We have been also unlucky in terms of our goals in forest information with the crisis. So the financial situation in the countries is not good. So we cannot, as Commission, we cannot ask them to do things that will cost them money if they don't have the means for doing so. What we are trying to do is to find synergies, to try to use as much as possible what is done in the countries. So, but I'm quite positive about MICE. So let's see how it goes in. But we are getting now better with the crisis, so hopefully it will continue into the assessment. Thank you.
Okay. Before thanking you again, I invite Umas here on the floor. It's a little gift for you.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Once again, I leave the floor to Joao.
Good morning. Our next speaker is Anna Lawrence. I'm not going to read her CV, her vast extent CV. I'm just going to mention a few things about Anna Lawrence that might be perhaps more interesting to describe the researcher and the person. First thing I wanted to mention is that Anna comes from Scotland, and that tells a lot about her character, her enthusiasm, and her determination about the things that she does. Another relevant thing is that she spends a lot of her spare time in forests, canoeing, walking in forests of Scotland mainly. To which she is contributing in several ways. She is part of Forest Ecosystem Restoration Project, trying to recover ancient forests in Scotland and to invert the trend of expansion of non-native plantations, non-native forest plantations in Scotland. She's also involved voluntarily in a group of associations and think tanks on forest democracy and in the integration of production and conservation in forestry. Last thing I want to mention is the enthusiasm, the energy, the passion that she puts in the things that she does, that I have witnessed over the last 2 years that I have worked with her in a project with Jesus as well. And that you are about to experience. So therefore, without any further ado, please welcome Anna Lawrence from Scotland.
Thank you, João, and thank you to UMAS and the committee for inviting me. It's really great to be here. Thanks for that introduction. And just in case you're concerned, I'm also a natural scientist and a social scientist, and I'm a professor of human dimensions of forestry. So it's not just that I walk through forests, but it's really good that you know more about the person, I think, than the academic context. Now, I'm really going to shift my focus, if I can find my presentation, and yeah, this is going to be a real shift of focus to focus down. It's a real contrast to that fantastic presentation from Jesus, and it's looking at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, the part of the knowledge base, which you said we had to form the roots of that tree. But this is a really hidden part of the knowledge base, I think. And I'm going to also change the format a little bit. I'm going to use the keynote slot as a way of thinking differently, of challenging some of the areas that we focus on and bringing perhaps different frameworks to look at bits of knowledge that I think get overlooked. So it's a kind of stirring things up rather than providing a masterly overview, which is what the keynotes have done so far. So, my big question is, given that forest management has to adapt, and we've heard that it has to adapt in the face of lots of change, how can the ideas in the adaptive forest management debate help? And I'm not a landscape ecologist, I'm a human ecologist, I'm a forester, and so I asked a colleague before I came, what do landscape ecologists think about? And he sent me a number of things to help me perhaps try to adjust to your perspective, and scale came out a lot. So I thought, okay, how can we really think about scale in this question? And I'm going to meander around a bit, and then we'll come back to scale at the end. And I'm stirring things up. I'm not providing sort of the ultimate answer to anything. So, forest ecosystems under pressure, lots of sources of uncertainty. We heard about this on day one, climate, directional change, but also unpredictable and extreme events. Then we've got tree health problems, and also the socio-economic, political aspects of uncertainty and unpredictability. And just an example here, quite a scary example of how the UK has experienced changes in threats to tree health over the last 50 years. We chugged along for quite a long time with just experiencing Dutch elm disease, and you can see there's been an exponential increase in the number of trees affected by serious tree pathogens in the last 10 to 20 years. So this is the kind of context in which we're working. So if the aim is to deal with these kind of threats and uncertainty by developing resilience, and this is very much the discourse that's emerging, the ways of dealing with this. One definition which will be familiar to many of you, the capacity of a system to deal with change, continue to develop, withstand shock, and to use such events to catalyse renewal and innovation. If we relate that to silviculture and how we manage forests, that's often understood to relate to improving species of genetic diversity, the stand diversity, the management methods, perhaps continuous cover forestry, and replacing the high-risk stands. So this is just context for what I'm about to talk about, but it's really saying change needs to happen at the level of forest practice, at the level of what foresters actually do. And I think these are really key actors, and we talk a lot about policy, we talk a lot about information and management decision-making, but what people actually do is a really important aspect of this. We've heard this in some of the sessions, particularly the ones from the Baltic Landscapes Project. There's been talk about practice and talk about involving practitioners, and this is an important angle on the whole question. So, we've got change, we're aiming for resilience. There's a lot of complexity and uncertainty in the system, so we can't really predict exactly how we should respond to that. The scientists seem to be needing time, the politicians seem to be needing time, but some change is happening on the ground. So adaptive management is an approach which seems to offer some promise, but it's also one which has been the subject of a lot of revision and questioning over the last few years. So I'm going to look at that, just introduce it briefly and look at the pros and cons of that before then applying it to some case studies. Now, the case studies are from my country, so please don't just think, oh, this is just about the UK, but it's me applying it to something and saying, how does this help us to think differently? Please step back from that and think about how it might work for you as well, or might not. I hope that I don't need to spend a lot of time defining adaptive management, but every paper you read on adaptive management either doesn't define it or has a different definition. So one which I like comes from Ecology and Society, a systematic process for continually improving management in conditions of complexity and uncertainty, so exactly what we have, by learning from the outcomes of experiments and operational practice. Really good point. I can't remember whether I added that or whether it was in the original definition. And then we look back at the people who first came up with the concept, and they also emphasized about learning, but changing and also learning, a tool which used not only to change a system, but also to learn about the system. And we have this nice, I can't find the pointer, so I'm not going to point. Oh, yeah, here we are. We have this nice diagram which emphasizes, the fact that it's a continuous process. It's meant to be iterative, and we have these really key stages of monitoring the effects of change. So we've had an explosion of interest in adaptive management. You can see there's been a real kind of frenzy of scientific papers. These red bars are the number of scientific papers per year on adaptive management, and the green bars are those papers which also relate to forestry. So you can see a big amount of discussion in the literature. But perhaps a slight tailing off as well, I think, and that's partly because people are starting to wonder, is this really as feasible as we thought it was? And this is just me mischievously flinging in, I don't set a lot of stock on these, but you can see that the social sciences perhaps have not carried their, I'm not very good with this pointer, have not carried their weight in thinking about adaptive management, so I'm trying to redress the balance here. Okay, so a little bit of just trying to summarize here what the literature about adaptive management has been saying recently. You've seen that explosion of papers, and there's been a few excellent reviews and rethinking about this in the last few years, partly because adaptive management is much more perhaps written about than actually done, and it's in a lot more policies than it's actually there in practice on the ground when people come along to examine it. Lucy Rist and her colleagues have pointed out that many definitions, every paper about adaptive management begins with, there's so many definitions of adaptive management, and some usages don't. So you can find papers which have adaptive management in the title and never refer to it again in the rest. So it's this kind of trendy thing which means we might get our paper published. If you look at the great range of what it has been applied to, there's the kind of woolly end. I don't like the word woolly because it's often used for social science. So there's the woolly end of the spectrum, which is trial and error, learning by doing, and there's the other, much more demanding end of the spectrum. It's a very systematic, planned experimental process over a large area. Jacobson has also pointed out there's this kind of split in the discourse between its experimentation and its collaborative. We need to bring those together. There's calls for more analysis, a more analytical approach, and it calls for looking at how the stakeholders actually engage with the process, not just do we get better technical results as a consequence of doing this, but how do stakeholders relate to it. And when we reviewed it in relation to how to apply in the UK, we found that really it's been, where it has been applied has been in countries with large areas of publicly owned managed natural forest, which is why my original title talked about old countries, but I decided that was much too complicated to try and defend that concept. So here I've just flagged up a couple of things from that review of what people are saying about adaptive management, and these feed into what I'm trying to do here. Trying to foster more analytical dialogue, in particular looking at what's the value of adaptive management for management. Not to bury ourselves in detailed questioning of, are we really doing adaptive management, but does it help us? Does the concept help us? And then this one of tracking and adjustment of evolving stakeholder perspectives. How do different people relate to the concept and relate to the content of what's going on? Okay, so that's the kind of the theory bit. And from that, I want to use this to apply it to, as I said, this component of the knowledge base, which is an easy one to overlook. There are, of course, those of us who are working in socio-ecological systems and with transdisciplinary research who are constantly interacting between policy, practice and science, but it's easily overlooked by many of us. So I've developed this list of 10 criteria. It does come from the 2 principal reviews recently, but I've sort of tweaked it to suit my own purposes and just to try to keep it simple, because you could come up with a list of 100 criteria of what does adaptive management expect. So these 10 are that there should be multiple sources of knowledge feeding into adaptive management. There should be multiple stakeholders. They should have explicit hypotheses. It should be based on a system model. There should be supportive policies and management processes. The effects should be monitored, leading to learning, leading to change. It's an iterative process, and it leads to reducing uncertainty. That's the ideal picture, and that's the kind of benchmark which I'm going to hold up to a few examples just now. I'm not going to elaborate case studies. I just want to illustrate a few examples which I've applied this to and see what questions that then brings up and what kind of light it shines on both our interpretation of practice, but also how we might step back and say, how does that contribute to our understanding of adaptive management and the kind of evolution of the concept? Okay, so very quickly, I said that I would talk about this in the context of the UK. Most of the countries we've heard about have got much nicer forestry and much more forests than we have. We've gone from 5% forest cover after the First World War to now it's 12% across the whole of the UK. It's 18% in Scotland. But that rapid expansion has been based on massive planting of monocultures of exotic conifers in a large part. And that conifer component is heavily dependent on Sitka spruce, which foresters absolutely love because it will do anything. You can plant it upside down, you can throw it around, it's very cheap and it will always grow. However, we get increasing numbers of threats, as I showed you from that graph. Larch, we're not planting in half the country now because it's affected by Phytophthora, and there are compulsory felling orders for large areas of larch. Same for pine in the east, so larch is in the west of the country, pine in the east of the country affected by Dothostroma, again compulsory felling and not allowed to replant. We also have a private sector which our social research has shown is reluctant to change, and a public sector which is nervous of enforcing change. So a context in which things are happening rather slowly. Just quickly to show you the distribution, I'm not going to go into all of these case studies, but these are the case studies which I'm referring to, and just to put it in context, here we are in Estonia, the green bubble up there, so not so far away. So, what kinds of changes am I talking about? Several of the examples I'll just give you today are government foresters working in state forests, and perhaps they've got more freedom to innovate, or perhaps not, because they work in a very rigid hierarchical system, and you might expect that they would just do exactly what the strategic plan tells. So, Thetford Forest in the east of England, there's largely Corsican pine, vast area of Corsican pine plantation, Dothostroma, red band needle blight, so can't plant Corsican pine anymore. This is disastrous, or an opportunity for change. So here you see the head planner looking at his Corsican pine, not very happy with it. However, a visiting specialist suggested that they thin heavily, open up the stand, create more air movement, and so the foresters suddenly had an environment in which they had a shady understory, but with space for trying out underplanting with a range of alternative conifers. So the phrase alternative conifers here means things which are not larch, Scots pine, Sitka spruce, and the standard kind of 3 or 5 conifers which have been planted on great scale. So they started planting cryptomeria, they started planting Douglas fir, which is unheard of in the east of the country, and they did this in secret for a little while until they had to ask their manager for money because they needed a fence to keep the deer out. So then actually they found that it didn't need to be secret. The manager was actually quite excited. Then the senior policy advisors got involved and they asked them to expand their experiment to 100 hectares instead of 1 hectare. Going to the other end of the country, so Scotland, my own country, a very different source of change, again affected by Dothastroma here and also wind throw. A lot of our forests are planted on upland, very wind-exposed areas. And they've been told, this is a top-down, not very learning-centred instruction, that they must diversify their species. These particular foresters were thrown into a little bit of a panic by that, didn't know what to do, looked up some books on different species, looked up some decision support tools, and they were horrified because the recommendation was that they should plant, that this site was most suitable for silver birch. I don't know how it is in everybody's countries, but silver birch has been treated as a weed throughout the last 100 years of forestry in the UK. So these foresters, very respectable government foresters, were suddenly finding that their scientific advice was to plant silver birch. But these guys, all credit to them, thought, okay, let's plant silver birch. This is extraordinary. This is a new thing in the uplands to be planting silver birch. And what they do is they're actually very curious about it, and they come back, they look at it, they bring their colleagues to discuss it. So it's kind of innovation by dictatorship, but they're exploring and learning from it. One more example from Scotland, again a government area where instead the forest district manager has got a very constructive approach to innovation, and he actually encourages his staff to conduct experiments, and he runs a competition who can get the best establishment of new conifers, different conifers, underplanted under the more standard conifers. So he's actually encouraging his staff to think differently. I wanted to contrast that with the private sector. We can't just generalize and say we have private forest owners and public forest ownership. We have a range of different kinds of private sector ownership, and quite a large part of it is investment forestry, where the main headline is to manage for profit, for financial reasons, and you get this kind of horrible forestry. But there are some very innovative advisors, consultants working in that field, but they emphasize that they don't really have the freedom and the scope to experiment, and that there would need to be a change in the policy environment to encourage that, unless they have one or two clients who are less interested in making maximum profit and want to try out something different. In contrast, there's quite a big sector of private ownership, which is the traditional estates. This particular one is in the southwest of England, but it's across the whole country, where people manage much more an integrated land use and thinking about landscape values as well as profit. And there are several of these which participate in a network which actually was founded in France, where they are applying. Okay, I'll move to my. That's not. I actually have 8 minutes. I'm going to disagree with that, but I'll try and make 5. Where they're using the data collected retrospectively from applying continuous cover forestry to build up a data set of what happens as a result of management consequences. So how they describe themselves as just a practicing forester. Others say most foresters aren't doing it except for a very few very good foresters. They describe it as exciting and terrifying at the same time. So this is the kind of change which is happening at ground level. So if we come back to those criteria which I said I would apply to this experience, what can we learn if we apply the adaptive management criteria to this experience of foresters innovating? We can say, yes, it's a diverse source of knowledge, but it's not lots of different sources of knowledge. Change is happening, but it's often invisible. There should be multiple stakeholders, but actually what we find is all the stakeholders come from within the forest management system. And I would say that if we think critically using adaptive management, it would encourage us to support communication between foresters and managers, between foresters and scientists, between the public and private sectors, and up to policy as well. Modelling and hypothesis, it doesn't happen explicitly. Foresters really don't use decision support tools very much. They may be implicitly modelling in their heads. Adaptive management would really push them to be more explicit about that. So somebody needs to change. Somebody needs to be a bit more flexible, and that's, I think, work is needed there. So is learning happening as a result? Often at the very local level, monitoring notoriously in adaptive management, this is not just from these examples, monitoring is a really weak point, and if there's no monitoring, you can't have learning, and the data is often lost. So change as a consequence is rather slow and piecemeal. It's often quite localized. There's few cross connections. There's not very much scaling up, but senior management is starting to take more interest, and it could be built in as more of a learning process. And again, looking back at the principles of adaptive management would help us to do that more explicitly. But does it reduce uncertainty? I think a lot more thinking is needed around this. People have started to question adaptive management. Can it work when the context continues to move and continues to be unpredictable? Uncertainty is reduced in the sense of I'm not sure if I'm going to keep the director happy or the sawmills happy or whatever. But uncertainty can be increased if you diversify species because you can be less sure that you're actually going to have a crop which you can sell at the end of it. So that's not clear yet. Turning the tables and asking how does this affect adaptive management? Adaptive management is an evolving and active, it's a very alive debate. This focus on practice would suggest that we need to pay much more attention to that deliberative part of adaptive management. At the beginning, where do the ideas come from? Who is innovating? How are we deciding what we should try out? Should it just be individuals doing it in secret and pretending that they're not? Or should we bring that out into the open? The relationship with resilience and diversity needs to be discussed and clarified a lot more. And this important one for me, it needs to link into the socio-ecological systems much more clearly, not just that adaptive management is good for society, but that society is part of the system which is adapting. So that brings us to scale issues and questions of learning. And here I'm just going to step back. So just 2 more slides, Giovanni, just to ask different ways about scale and learning, what's going on here. And I've brought in, again, a framework which comes from the 1970s, which describes this as single loop, double loop, and triple loop learning. It's a very helpful concept for looking at what's the level and scale of learning that's going on. Single loop would say, are we doing things the right way? Are we playing according to the rules? Double loop learning, are we doing the right things? Have we got the processes correct? And triple loop learning is saying, how do we decide what is right? Have we got the right principles? And you can see that as you go up the scale, you might focus from single to double to triple loop. And this is where I said this is a rather creative part of this presentation. It's not final, it's me kind of like adjusting things late at night just before I spoke with you, but thinking, how does this apply? Given that you're landscape ecologists, you're thinking about scale, if we take these examples of practice and we look at people going through the different scales, at single loop learning is happening where just one forester is doing some experiments on his own in private. Double loop is where he starts to share it with his colleagues, might change the strategic plan, and triple loop is where the whole planning process is shaken up and they say, okay, if we have climate change, we have all these pest and disease outbreaks, we need to change the way we think about forest planning in this country. You can see parallels in the forest management system and then the socio-political system. And this is where I think scales vary, not in that continuous way that they do in ecology, where ecosystems merge on a more continuous way, but on the socio-political level, you've got discrete levels of governance. And so the learning processes might vary as you go from individuals learning to local government, spatial planning, and then to international policy-making processes. And the learning approaches that you would use within that might also vary. I'm throwing this out, this is just for ideas at the moment, but the single loop might depend on personal reflection, then you bring in sharing at the double loop level, and the triple loop level, it might be a full-scale policy consultation process and organisational change. So I think it's a helpful framework for thinking about both the social and ecological processes going on at different scales. My conclusions really just reiterate what I said. Informal experiments by foresters are an important contribution to change in forestry. It's the other end of the telescope from what Jesus was talking about, but it's part of the picture. We could learn from it much more effectively if we put it into a more rigorous framework, and adaptive management has something to contribute to that. But conversely, the adaptive management debate could learn from practice and could pay much more attention to the deliberation innovation processes and the integral role of social and ecological in different levels of scale. And just to bring this right back home, I was worrying yesterday on our field trip, which was fantastic, by the way, that this was only something parochial in my own country. And Tunis, who was our guide and was a forest district manager, said about his own experiences of innovating, he said, there are always crazy people in every country. And then our Swedish representative said, and you should always listen to them because they always have something to say. So, thank you very much for listening. Is it time?
Thank you. It's right.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions. Okay. So we start from the back.
Thank you, Anna, for this very interesting presentation. When we are talking about processes, the processes, they take place in time. Also adaptive management and also has to be understood in terms of time.
Yeah.
I was missing a little bit the time approach in your presentation. If you can say something about that, no time scale.
Yeah. Maybe because I was arguing with Giovanni about time. There just wasn't enough time to talk about time. This is at early stages, and when what I was trying to say about that, so management is changing, but will it anticipate further change? I think the scale at which this is, there's a bigger contextual process in which this is happening. So people are conducting experiments, but we're also stepping back and saying, what are the processes going on here? Not just the process of experimentation, but the process of learning. And as we learn about the process of learning, we can build it into a bigger scale. And it means that as time unfolds, we would hope that the managers would say, we want to be more supportive to more experiments. So the whole thing, the scale grows through time. Beyond that, I can't really say, because this is kind of a novel process and a novel focus. Does that help you?
Because also I'm thinking that the values, they change. We use no resources according to certain values. And in time, when you look this in long-term perspective, yesterday we were like, oh, we took this one, it's got 100 years.
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
The values, they change.
Yeah, I could actually talk for another half hour on changing values. It's interesting because my hope would be that foresters and forest management and policy would come to value silviculture, because it's not been valued in these horrible forest management systems, and to value diversity and the learning processes and experimental processes. Those are the values I would want to see incorporated. We see some shift, but time will tell. Because innovation, when people think about innovation, if you research the literature on innovation in forestry, it's all about new bits of machinery. It's not about innovation in silviculture. It's not about ways that we change how we're actually engaging with the forest. And that's the nuts and bolts of forestry. So it's a really important topic, but it's almost invisible so far.
So we take last question. You please.
I was wondering, I got the impression from the talk that most of the experiments were related with the inclusion of new species, and they were basically from the perspective of curiosity or productivity. So that also comes with a risk that there could be like new pests, new invasive species. So that experimentation also carry a risk, and we are not assessing, or you're not focusing at any point on that. And my question is how we keep that innovation and engagement of the people, and at the same time has a kind of a scientific control over those experiments, because they can carry very negative things as well.
Yeah. And this is partly why I raised the question, because the idea behind adaptive management is that you should be assessing which is the best option, whereas actually maintaining diversity is part of resilience. So the idea of adaptive management might also need to shift in that sense, so that the learning processes are towards developing diversity rather than just developing an idea of which is the best species for this context. My examples were from diversification of species, because that was part of a separate project which was looking at what are the barriers and opportunities for adopting a different range of species. But it could also apply to adoption of continuous cover forestry, or I mean, I have other examples from that as well. So, but yes, I think it needs. That's why I brought in the discussion about resilience at the beginning, because actually it's a part of the jigsaw. But we're not very clear about how resilience, adaptive management, and experimentation all link together. And you could do adaptive management and say, well, this is the best species, but that would be failing to learn, and it'd be failing to do the timescale thing which he was talking about. That we can't just have one solution, because this is where adaptation and adaptive management are completely different. Adaptation means you made the change and it's the right change. Adaptive management means you keep your options open and you keep the processes going.
We have time for a last question, extra question, so please, before we close.
I agree with you that people learn from practice, but there is a question that people have different way of taking decisions. So, and there are many different planning paradigms. For instance, you can, according to different planning paradigm, you face differently uncertainty. For instance, in a rational, comprehensive paradigm, you treat uncertainty in one way, and you treat uncertainty in a different paradigm. I mean, strategic planning decision process or planning process. So my question is, do you think that the way you plan may involve the way in which you manage?
Yes, of course. But that's partly why I emphasized here that what the foresters are doing, as I said, it's often in private, it's often secret, it's intuitive, it's not scientifically designed, and this is part of why that scaling up the learning processes from the individual plot to the forest district to government might result in a change to planning processes, because if the higher level stakeholders are more aware of these processes going on, they might incorporate them more clearly into planning. But you could also kill some of that initiative and some of that innovative spirit if you're not careful. So I'm partly saying this is the culture in which people are doing this, and we should recognize and treasure some of that. We should build it in, but we should also recognize that we're going to have to learn from something where chaos and innovation and love of trees and forestry is part of the motivation, and we need to respond to that as well as try to systematize it and rationalize it and control it.
Okay. Thank you again. I think Urmas Pettersson has something special for Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So nice. Thank you.
I would like to thank both guest speakers for coming and for their wonderful presentations. And we move now for a coffee break, and we'll be back in 30 minutes. Thank you.